Buenas tardes, buenos dias, good morning, everyone. It's a real pleasure to welcome you all to this seminar, Atlantic Approaches to Global Challenges, Sustainability, Recovery, and New Security Threats. This is the second webinar of the Jean Monnet Atlantic Network 2.0, which is financed by the Erasmus Plus program of the European Commission. As you probably know, this network, this Jean Monnet Atlantic Network, has a history of very fruitful cooperation. That it began with the Atlantic Future Project within the FP7 research program of the European Union in 2013, and then it was continued with the first edition of the Jean Monnet Network of Atlantic Studies, which ran from 2016 to 2019, and then now with the second edition of the Jean Monnet Atlantic Network, which is currently running until 2023. During these years, the idea is to study the Atlantic, to take a look at the Atlantic as a laboratory of globalization. And we've analyzed, and we are analyzing pan-Atlantic relations in the framework of the current international changes and the developments that are taking place beyond the Atlantic. Today and during this seminar, we've had the occasion to collaborate with the EU-LAC Foundation that is also behind today's activity and that has been part of its preparation and its running. And that gives us the perspective and the idea to try to foster interregional cooperation between the EU and the Latin America and the Caribbean. And that in the context, of course, of a broader concept of transatlantic relations, ranging not only from the traditional European-US relations, but also including as much as possible Latin America and the Caribbean, and why not also Africa. That was the idea from the beginning of the Atlantic Future Project, and it is an idea that is still running and behind the developments taking place in the framework of the Jean Monnet Network. As you know, this alliance is formed by 6 think tanks that are part of this Jean Monnet Atlantic Network, and together with EU-LAC Foundation, will try to multiply the effect and the impact of this dialogue and increase the number of voices present in our discussions. Of course, today it's a very timely opportunity to discuss the state of interregional relations. Of course, things have changed in the north of America with the election of Joe Biden. Things are also changing in Europe as a consequence of the pandemic and the recovery plan taking form right now as we speak, in trying to recover and in a better fashion in the European Union. But also, of course, it makes total sense to include to this discussion Latin America and the Caribbean, but also Africa, in trying to see what sort of interregional relations will take place after the pandemic, and precisely with the idea not to leave anyone behind when it comes to post-pandemic recovery, and of course also to the vaccination programs happening, that should be happening in a just way, in an equitable way all over the globe. During this session, we will have different panels that will discuss, on the one hand today, under the leadership of EU-LAC, multilateralism and how multilateralism must evolve after the pandemic. Then we will have another panel later today on the regional visions in the fight against climate change in the path towards COP26. And then tomorrow we will have the third panel, in which we will be discussing NATO and the NATO Summit, with the idea to revitalize the transatlantic security agenda with a global vision. And last but not least, transborder economic flows from an Atlantic perspective. That will be the topic of our fourth panel tomorrow afternoon. for European time zones. So without further ado, it's a real pleasure, as I said, to welcome you all. We will count on multiple voices, reputed specialists who will be taking part in the discussions, also practitioners, current and former policymakers from the 4 regions of the Atlantic, in order to enhance the plural vision of this seminar and stimulate the debate between the different actors and visions. I'm sure this will be a very good occasion to mark the importance of the Jean Monnet Atlantic Network, in which we have the pleasure to collaborate from CDOP, the Barcelona Center for International Affairs, and from my side, a warm welcome to you all in this seminar. I give now the floor for some introductory remarks to Renato Flores, who is the director of the International Intelligence Units of the Fundação Getúlio Vargas in Brazil. Renato, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon.
Renato, thank you. Okay. Now we can hear you.
The mic is on. Good morning and good afternoon to all who are watching us now, depending on the hemisphere in which you are. As the main coordinator of the Jean Monnet Network, number 2 on the Atlantic, as Paul very clearly outlined the history of these endeavors, I'm very, very glad to open this seminar, this webinar, which I think was a very good idea we had by the end of last year, in the beginning of this year, because the pandemic was jeopardizing completely our schedule. And then we moved first to webinars instead of presential meetings. The first one was held by FGV itself in Rio, let us say, virtual, was very good. And I think that this time CDOP made a wonderful job. If you look at the agenda of the meeting, is an outstanding agenda. I think all the main issues at stake are there. Speakers are very, very good. So I am looking forward as a citizen and as an observer also, beyond a member of the project, to the outcome of this seminar. We also have the very precious aid from EU-LAC Foundation. I'm very glad to acknowledge this. We'll have another a follow-up to this event in December, if I'm not mistaken, with Brussels, with our partners in Brussels. So it's a great pleasure to welcome EU-LAC Foundation on board. Please, thank you very much for your help. And we wish that this is the start, as in the movie, of a long-standing cooperation and relationship with the foundation and the network. So I won't add anything else. I just want to complement what Paul has just said, that the pandemic has posed very difficult challenges to us. The project was already difficult since the Atlantic Future, as my Catalan friends remember. The number of issues was very vast. And now with the COVID and the pandemic, and this, I am a pessimist in this sense, with this kind of gloomy future I'm afraid we are going to live in the next years, I think that in the project we have a greater responsibility, and we must think, we must help European Union, we must help our countries to have good ideas and find good policies to cope with the problems that are behind the door. So thank you very much. Good morning, good afternoon. Thank you and congratulations, Paul. Welcome EU-LAC Foundation, and let us have a wonderful webinar. Thank you very much.
Ernesto, the floor is all yours.
Okay. Thank you very much, Renato, for your kind remarks. I would start by saying that the partnership between the European Union Latin America, and the Caribbean is based on close historical, cultural ties and shared values and aspirations such as commitment to democracy, human rights, and the rule of law. The search for sustainable development for a prosperous, inclusive society committed to respecting the environment and fighting and climate change. Over the years, the two parties have progressively built a relationship based on mutual respect and open dialogue. In 1999, a bi-regional strategic partnership was established, which provides a consensual and dynamically evolving framework for political dialogue and cooperation in specific areas of mutual interest. Therefore, by decision of the heads of states and government, in 2010, the EU-LAC Foundation was established and has been operating in the city of Hamburg since 2011. This year, we are actually completing 10 years since we started operating. And the EU-LAC Foundation is actually an instrument to promote the bi-regional partnership, made up of 61 countries of the European Union, Latin America, and the Caribbean, as well as the European Union itself, for a total of 62 members. The foundation became an international intergovernmental organization in May 2019, with the entry in force of its founding agreement. The EU-LAC Foundation has two purposes: contributing to the strengthening of the bi-regional partnership process between the European Union, Latin America, and the Caribbean, involving the participation and inputs from civil society and other social actors, like the academia. And the other purpose is promoting mutual knowledge, improving the mutual visibility of the bi-regional association. In response to this mandate, and recognizing and taking account the priorities of the bi-regional dialogue between the European Union, Latin America, and the Caribbean, the Foundation opens every year a public call to co-organize debate and exchange events on global and sectorial issues that are related or relevant to the bi-regional association. That's why in the call for proposals that we launched at the end of last year, we were very grateful to have selected 4 events. And one of the events that we are co-organizing is precisely this one, in which we had selected as partners the Fundação Getúlio Vargas and the CDOB to not just only today in this webinar, but also in a forthcoming, hopefully face-to-face event by the end of the year, related to the challenges of multilateralism towards the bi-regional agenda. So for us, again, it's very grateful to be with yourselves on this endeavor, and I hope we can have a fruitful debate. We will be moderating the first panel, which will talk specifically on the challenges of the multilateralism in the 21st century. And I would like also to thank the other organizers, because this partnership actually evolved to the partnership more broadly with the Jean Monnet Network 2.0. That for us was a great opportunity to join. I am now giving these initial speeches in behalf of the Executive Director, Dr. Adrian Bonilla, who was in a previous meeting with the European Commission. He couldn't join us at the time of this inauguration, but he will be with us right now on the first panel that will be discussing the multilateralism in the 21st century. Thank you very much.
Do I begin, Ernesto?
Yes. Well, we will start now the first panel that's entitled Jean Monnet EU-LAC Panel Multilateralism 2.0, How 21st Century Multilateralism Should Look Like. In this first panel, we will address the prospects for multilateralism in the 21st century in light of the various geopolitical events that have occurred especially in the last decade, such as the rise of nationalist governments, the Washington-Beijing global trade dispute, the Brexit, among others events, and especially the consequences of the pandemic of COVID-19. This series of events in the last decade have caused some fissures in the global governance, as well as in the in multilateral system that must be addressed. The understanding of these new events, the recognition of these fissures, and the comprehension of new trends and the approach of new strategies are paramount tasks to shed some light on how multilateralism will develop in the next decade, the next 10 years. That's why we intend to discuss here today with our panelists. So we will be assessing in this panel the multilateralism, how the multilateralists have evolved in the 20th century since the Second World War, talking about three guiding questions. The first one is, what were its major flaws and contributions for the multilateralism? What are the changes in the global order that would increase the international system's resilience? What are the perceptions and the perspectives, as well as the contributions from the Atlantic Basin regions and partnership in shaping a renewed global multilateral system that we can be called as 2.0? In this debate, we have the pleasure to have Dr. Adrian Bonilla, Executive Director of the EU-LAC Foundation, Dr. Rebecca Ulfgaard from Instituto Mora, Dr. Ana Covarrubias from Colegio de Mexico, and Dr. Christian Leroux from Aladi. We will start we don't have here an order, but I will start this debate calling Dr. Adrian Bonilla, which I would like to introduce him. Dr. Adrian Bonilla has a doctorate and master's degree in international relations from the University of Miami. He holds a bachelor's degree in public and social science from the Central University of Ecuador. And before joining the EU-LAC Foundation as executive director, Dr. Bonilla was National Secretary of Higher Education, which has a ministerial rank in his country, Ecuador, from 2018 to 2019. He served as well as Secretary General for the entire region at the Latin American Faculty of Social Sciences, FLACSO, between 2012-2016, and also as Director of the Office of FLACSO in Ecuador from 2004-2012. Dr. Bonilla has published as author and editor more than 15 books and numerous articles in prestigious academic journals and books in Latin America and the Caribbean, Europe, and United States. He has been a lecturer and visiting professor at several universities and is current member of editorial bodies of Global Governance, Contexto Internacional, and CDOB itself, among other specialized publications. His working topics are related to foreign policy, security, and multilateralism in Latin America and the Caribbean. He was also vice president of the advisory board on foreign relations in Ecuador, and has also served as an international electoral observer. He has been a governing member of the Council of International Relations of Latin America, of the Latin America Defense Studies Network, of the Global Observatory of European Union Latin American Relations, OBREAL, and of the Ibero-American Network of International Relations, RIBEI. The floor is yours, Dr. Bonilla.
Thank you, Ernesto. After this presentation, I feel like a very, very old person. Well, I want to speak from a point of view locating the relationship between Latin America, the Caribbean, and Europe as the center of the presentation. And I would like to address multilateralism within a couple of conventional images of the international order. The first one, if we conceive the international order as a scenario of asymmetric distribution of capabilities, we observe the Euro-Latin American and Caribbean relationship as a relationship within a world of conflict and necessities. We needed to visualize the need of an international relationship between the both regions in terms of something destined to neutralize bipolar world. Even if only in economic terms, this scenario is going to be formed in the next years. This scenario would be inconvenient for the interests of countries at the south of the Rio Grande and for Europe. The Cold War, at least for Latin America and the Caribbean, for example, limited their development possibilities and dramatically affected the development of democratic institutions and the exercise of minimum freedoms in the countries of the region. If we take the idea of globalization to describe the international order, and within it the relations between Latin America, the Caribbean, and Europe, the idea of interdependence may be the account for the type of interactions that are established between societies and nations. This type of interdependence is not normally symmetrical and generally is always complex, as more than one issue characterizes these relations. The asymmetries in the relationship between the two regions, however, have a set of mediations that mitigate the impact, especially in Latin America and the Caribbean, of the asymmetry. If we think multilateralism from this point of view, from this perspective, we have to think how are going we to characterize the changes in the global order in the next 20 or 30 years that will increase the international resilience of multilateralism. And the answer would come from a background that refers to multilateralism as a current, articulated, and global construction resulting from the international order after the Second World War. The multilateralism, the current multilateralism is expressed, I think, by an emblematic example, which is the United Nations system, which is the consequence of a set of initiatives of the countries of the Atlantic Basin, which of course required the incorporation at some point of the Soviet Union to have a global vision, and later in the last century, the incorporation of China replacing Taiwan. But since then, the United Nations system has had from the beginning the membership of Latin America and most of the countries of the Caribbean Basin. And it helped to generate the image of a global system. In all these precedents, perhaps the most outstanding of them before the United Nations systems, the League of Nations, the Atlantic countries, and above all, those Latin America and some of the countries of the Caribbean encouraged this type of instrumentalization. The Latin American and Caribbean countries were founders of the League of Nations and were among the last to abandon this organization, just as they were among the first to build the United Nations system. The idea of multilateralism is an idea that cut across the interests, values, and beliefs of the governments of the two hemispheres. When we talk about resilience, we have to incorporate the image that we are talking about multilateralism, not only not only as a representation of the relationships between governments, but it refers to a global society where the agency of social movements, for example, is becoming less domestic, less autarkic, and more globalized. Political, social movements such as the feminisms are increasingly global, and their agency, for example, has a meaning and significance in that dimension, in the global dimension. Movements as ecologism or environmentalism have clearly a global action, a global agency that require a series of instruments for coordination. To this, it must be added the interaction between business and labor groups, traditional social movements on both sides of the ocean, but which in a context of productive and political globalization demonstrate the need to have multilateral instruments to process their interests and needs. So when we talk about multilateralism, we have to talk not only as an instrument of the relationships between governments and states, but there are a lot of global relationships between civil society actors and agents that need to be visualized also as actors of multilateral relationships between different social actors beyond the states and the governments. Therefore, when we speak of multilateralism, we cannot summarize it as a set of instruments that process only interstate relationships, but also as a set of instruments that regulate and processes different international agents, in other words, different actors of a global society. Multilateralism is seen in this way as the consequence of a phenomenon that is structural, that goes beyond the will or the decision makers of the governments, and in this sense is resilient as long as this condition, that of globality, persists, which is what we have to presume for the foreseeable future. Perceptions, perspectives, and contributions of the Atlantic countries in the shaping of a renewed multilateral international or global system are what we could say behaviors in the both sides of the oceans. Perhaps with more emphasis in Latin America, we have to identify some sort of political tensions between the global nature of the social phenomena and the capabilities of the governments to process the inputs of the societies. And as a result of this contradiction, this tension, we have this idea of sovereignty coming from the governments in order to control the society, to control the territory, and to control the population. But this emergence of nationalistic views, this emergence of sovereignty-based policies is not only but the outcome of the complexity of a global society. So what we have in fact is the organization of a global society which is linked by a lot of procedures, a lot of norms, a lot of relationships that we could call, from a sociological perspective, multilateralism also. So my point here is to think globalization as social relationships or a set of social relationships, and if we have this vision, we have to acknowledge also the idea of multilateralism as a social way of relationship between not only governments and states, but persons and social groups. And if we think that globalization is the structural origin of this complexity in the relationships, we have to acknowledge at the same time that we have a resilient multilateral set of relationships between persons and social groups. And well, I stop here pointing out this idea.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bonilla. Actually, I was about to alert the panelists that before, but the idea is that each of yourselves could make a brief 15 minutes initial intervention. And after this first round of interventions, we will open for debate. Now that I see Professor Dr. Rebecca with us, before I pass the floor to Dr. Rebecca Villanueva Ulfgaard, I would introduce her. Dr. Rebecca Villanueva Ulfgaard is Associate Professor in International Studies at the Instituto Mora, Mexico City. She has published in international journals and editorials on Mexico's international development cooperation, civil society participation in foreign policy, and transition to the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, and participation in the G20. She is the lead editor of the series Governance, Development, and Social Inclusion in Latin America with the Palgrave Macmillan. The floor is yours, Dr. Rebecca.
Thank you, Jäger. Thank you to the organizers for the invitation. Very glad to be here. I'm sitting outside in Mexico because I have a somewhat shaky internet connection. So I hope that you can bear with some occasional noise in the background. No? So glad to be with you. It's a very interesting webinar. Very glad to hear the first intervention by Professor Adrian Bonilla. So I'd like to follow up on a few of his ideas about what multilateralism stands for. Well, beginning with the first question then. So what are the contributions of multilateralism in the 20th century? Well, so precisely as Dr. Bonilla was saying, it's a social way of constructing relationships, not just among sovereign states, but actually also different groups of society, you know, both interest in private sector and civil society, academics, associations, and so forth. No? So it's larger than what we perhaps sometimes may think, that it concerns first and foremost states. No? Because precisely in new multilateralism, there's a literature called New Multilateralism. There are several articles and academic compiled books and so on with different strands of analysis covering this concept. No? But to return to the toolbox of multilateralism, no? So it helps securing the relevance of international organizations and institutions as the principal path for sovereign states, and also involving increasingly the non-state actors to engage in a continuous dialogue to resolve disputes and conflict by peaceful means. And this toolbox contains then generalized principles of conduct based on indivisibility and diffuse reciprocity. Well, we know these concepts from, for instance, the academic literature of John Ruggie, from also other social constructivists and scholars working in the tradition of liberal institutionalism, for instance, Cohen and Nye. We have then this growing body also of other types of scholarships who are actually criticizing then power relationships within then this kind of new multilateralism as well. But I will not deal with an theorist today, no, but precisely multilateralism helps fostering then greater economic and political integration within and between regions. And it also promotes deeper, complex interdependence in an increasingly globalized world. So I think that these are the important contributions of multilateralism. No? And what we see these concepts and the toolbox of multilateralism put in practice in the UN system, for instance, when we are talking about human development, with the Human Development Report since the early 1990s, we see it in the efforts targeting poverty reduction and also the Millennium Development Goals, the Sustainable Development Goals, the 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda, with the theme of leaving no one behind and putting the furthest behind first. We also see multilateralism in the talks about human security, a broadening of the traditional notion of security associated mostly with hard power. No? Then it's also worth mentioning two other areas in which multilateralism has been the backbone. That is, of course, climate change, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change since 1992, the Conference of the Parties, a mechanism that we have seen over the years developing, no? Also with this influence of non-state actors. No? We have the Brundtland Report from 1987, the Kyoto Protocol 97, and the Paris Agreement from 2015 as then clear examples of how then multilateralism within the UN system has fostered kind of a common understanding about the challenges for our planet, for humanity as concerns then climate change. No? Then we have another topic, another big package, a chunk of finding common solutions to problems, which is then in the area, of course, of trade liberalization. No? The role of WTO, the role also of the Bretton Woods institutions, OECD, the dispute settlement mechanism, court rulings, and of course the appellate body of the WTO. So if that is more a part of the positive side, so to say. The flaws of multilateralism in the 20th century, I have divided my analysis in two chunks. No? First and foremost about then assessing the strength of international institutions, qua institutions. No? So what about these organizations, international organizations, their structure, their normative and legal framework, their capacity to induce compliance, accountability mechanisms. There have been critical observers who claim that multilateralism has been lacking teeth, that we are suffering from weak enforcement mechanism and weak norm and rule compliance. There's also perception that there are different yardsticks applying to great powers, no? As in difference to medium-sized and smaller powers. No? So, and also, for instance, the obstacles for to a fully functioning multilateral negotiation framework to really create solutions and to, for instance, protect peace, preserve human rights. The constant topic that is on the table is, of course, the reforming of the UN Security Council, well, with the 5 veto powers, no, and the blockages in for instance, in February 2012, when both China and Russia blocked a resolution condemning Bashar al-Assad's violence against his own population and called for an implementation of the Arab League's proposed peace plan. No? So there we can see the failings of multilateralism in, for instance, the UN system, if we look at the UN Security Council. No? We could also mention, of course, the International Criminal Court, the Rome Statute, and the difficulty to uphold precisely this whole package of preserving peace through the UN Charter of Human Rights. Huh? Then another factor is about political leadership. I think it's very important to look at the lack of political will, no? The quality of state leaders. No? We have seen several examples of state leaders. They are presenting their speeches and delivering nice speeches in the UN, for instance, but they are doing little at home or abroad in foreign policy and in international development cooperation initiatives to actually deliver on those compromises made in multilateral negotiations. So I think there's a need for critical examination of state leaders' real commitment to global agendas and multilateral solutions. No? Needless to say then that the unilateralism and disruptive agenda of Donald Trump made then the US appear as one of the strongest detractors, actually, of the current international institutional architecture and the multilateralist tradition that has been forged since the end of the Second World War. Contrasting then with the leadership, for instance, of Angela Merkel and Germany, who actually presented itself as a leading promoter of multilateralism, both in then, for instance, club governance like the G7 and the G20, but also advocating for solutions to tackle climate change, for instance. No, so if Trump was seeing multilateral negotiations as a zero-sum game, no, that really has a contrast then with then the leadership by Germany. No? I think that when it comes to the second question, what are the changes in the global order that would increase the international system's resilience? No, I think there's a need for returning to rule-based multilateralism. Again, for instance, looking at the example of Donald Trump, no, and when he was in power in the White House, the blockage that the U.S. administration caused to the WTO dispute settlement mechanism, no, because of this refusal to give green light, no, for the procedure of appointments to fill the vacancies in the appellate body, no, and that became then a clear example of the America First or Make America Great Again. So I think that there is a need for then abide by the rules, abide by common standards, and principles, because that's precisely what multilateralism is about. Also, that there is a shared set of principles. The toolbox is there for everyone to use, but there's also this expectation that actually states and leaders will actually play with the same tools. No. Second point, I'd like to say a few words about then how to increase international systems resilience. I think it's very important, as also Dr. Bonilla was talking about, the global dimension of politics, no? So, and the capabilities of governments to process the demands by society, by different groups in society for shaping public policies, and also then including foreign policy and, for instance, development cooperation initiatives. No? So we have to think about then how to strengthen representation and legitimacy. No? And in particularly between then these multilateral frameworks and countries in the global south and groups of multi-stakeholder actors from the global south, no? Their interest in partaking in those discussions and actually shaping the policy responses to common problems. We need to address forcefully this whole idea about whole of society approach, whole of government approach, breaking with silo thinking, and thinking really about also how to create better accountability mechanisms. So both the input side of legitimacy and the output side of legitimacy, as Fritz Sharp in his one of his studies he pointed to. No? We also have to then look into the themes, specific themes of digitalization, automation, and how these kinds of technological advances can actually then support initiatives to promote the pendulum swing of global governance, tilting then towards more of cooperation, no? To strengthen then both North and South cooperation within multilateral negotiations and frameworks, but also South-South cooperation. We see now following the pandemic a growing interest in developing regional supply chains, for instance. So if the global supply chains have shown signs of weaknesses, no? This whole complex global interconnectivity, maybe there's a need now for trying to developing further the regional integration schemes and regional supply and value chains, for instance. No? But we have to do that under this assumption that we need to then bring in more of non-state actors. We have to broaden actually participation in order to increase then representativity and legitimacy of those political processes, where we would like them to see more of integration, more of cooperation. No? If that is then in increasing horizontal cooperation, but also sort of a vertical cooperation, then I think it's relevant then to look at the different technical expertise provided by international organizations like the WHO, because these technical expertise from the OECD, for instance, also can help developing those initiatives to strengthen regional cooperation and regional integration. No? And I also think it's important then to recognize the challenges coming with a multiplex world order, the regional blocs gravitating around leading emerging powers and major regional organizations. But we also have to keep an eye on club governance, for instance, like in the G20, and specific emerging powers like India and China, the China's Belt and Road Initiative, of course, China's debt book diplomacy, initiatives like the New Development Bank and Asian Infrastructure and Investment Bank. And if I quickly have some time to go through the third point, what are the perceptions and perspectives, as well as contributions from the Atlantic Basin regions in shaping a renewed global and multilateral system? Well, I think that the TTIP agreement will not see the light as it was really perhaps planned for. There are differences between the European Union and American interests, for instance, in areas of agriculture. And on the other hand, also EU access to US procurement markets. We are having then European capitals still figuring out about what to make of the stances of Biden, of Harris, and of Kerry. It's interesting to see that John Kerry, he was designed the cabinet level climate envoy, and also what will then come out of the COP26 in Glasgow in November this year. How will then the US present initiatives, some initiatives together with, for instance, the European Commission, in order to tackle climate change, but also to think about green recovery after the pandemic. So what might come out of a stronger than cooperation between, on the one hand, the new administration in the White House and, of course, the European Commission, backed up then by of course, the capitals of Europe, no? But I think that there's still a bit of a wait and see where the new US leadership will take those kinds of multilateral negotiations, for instance, in climate change. And another one concerns the BEPS initiative, for instance, the OECD base erosion and profit shifting initiative. I think that there are interesting developments ahead for multilateralism. And I think that hopefully with strengthening cooperation, involving then not just then the US and the European Union, but actually also then the African Union, for instance. We will see what will come out of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, which came into force in January this year, as already from 2018, but it has now began its operating under this new scheme, really. And I think also then the initiatives in Latin America for strengthening cooperation in those different regional cooperation mechanisms. So I think that it's also interesting to see how they can be linked with the overall dialogue between then the European Union on the one hand and then the US on the other hand. And so I think that the climate change and also financing for development and migration, these are the three important areas where we will see more of multilateral, hopefully multilateral solutions in the future. And I think I should stop there because of the time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rebecca. I will pass now the floor to Dr. Ana Covarrubias. Dr. Ana Covarrubias is professor researcher at the Center for International Studies of El Colegio de Mexico and is actually vice president for international academic affairs. She received her doctorate in international relations from Oxford University. She has written on Mexican foreign policy, especially relations with Cuba, and more recently with the United States, and human rights and foreign policy. Another field of interest is Latin America, regionalism, and the inter-American system. She teaches international relations theory, foreign policy analysis, Mexican foreign policy, US-Latin American relations, and US and Canadian foreign policy. Her more recent publications include In Search of International Influence, Mexico as an Entrepreneurial Power, with Jorge Schiavon in International Journal 2018, and Mexico, Actor con Responsabilidad Multilateral, in Foro Internacional in 2019. Please, the floor is yours, Dr. Ana Rubios.
Thank you. Sorry. Thank you. Thank you very much. And good morning from Mexico City. Well, first of all, I would like to thank the Jean Monnet Atlantic Network, CIDOP, EU-LAC Foundation, and the Getulio Vargas Foundation for inviting me to be here this morning in a very interesting discussion on multilateralism. I would like to apologize because I'm going to repeat some of the elements that both Adrian and Rebecca have already said. I'll try not to do that, but in case I do, I apologize beforehand. And I will try to be very brief so that we can have ideas for discussion, but that we can open a more general discussion. So regarding the first question, assessing multilateralism in the 20th century, major flows and contributions. My first reaction to this question would be, we cannot claim complete success and we cannot claim complete failure from different multilateral efforts. And I would like to differentiate the different kinds of multilateral efforts, because I think each has its own logic. So we have first, of course, the more comprehensive efforts, which is basically the League of Nations and the United Nations, and as Adrian already mentioned. And I think the main lesson from this more comprehensive multilateralism is that they can succeed as long as major interests of the great powers are not involved. And of course, the Security Council is the best example. If the great powers have priorities, especially in security, we will see that it doesn't work, in most of the times. But when we don't see that there are priorities involved, the great powers' priorities involved, we can see some success in different topics, in different regions, in different aspects of multilateralism. So I think that would be one of the major lessons we learned in the 20th century. Then we have the European Union, and I think, and this is, I'm speaking from the Americas, basically, from the Americas experience in multilateral efforts. I think we should leave the European Union as a unique case and do not try to emulate or imitate it, because we won't get anywhere. There are very specific political, ideological, historical reasons that explain the European community first and then the European Union. And they cannot be replicated elsewhere. And this is very much the case in the Americas. The discussion has been in the Americas, why don't we have supranational institutions? Why don't we have common values? Why don't we have, all these mechanisms? Well, because our history is different, because our countries are different, and we cannot have that. And basically because we have now the great power in the continent. So it's really very difficult to imitate the European Union. So in this case, I would like to say, well, yes, it is theoretically a very good example. The European Union has expanded, the European Union has deepened, but this hasn't happened elsewhere. So we should leave the European Union, I think, as a unique case and take what is, practical and viable, and do not try to imitate it as the only model for regional institutions, for multilateral institutions. And then we have regional multilateralism. And again, I'm going to speak from the Americas case. We have, of course, the OAS, which is a very unique case as well, because of the asymmetry of power between the United States and the Latin American countries. And we have seen the Organization of American States working in very few cases and not working most of the time because of this asymmetry and because of other reasons that I will explain a bit later regarding the Latin American countries, regarding the interests of the Latin American countries and the nature of the state in the Latin American countries. In this way, I have already said, one of the major arguments is that Latin American multilateralism has not worked because there are no supranational institutions. And the counter-argument in this case would be, well, they might not be supranational institutions, but if we have, for example, presidential-led multilateralism and it works, it's okay. What we want really is multilateralism to work, not to imitate other instances. We want collective action that is more efficient. And if in this case, presidents are the major instruments to work multilateralism, that's fine. And the last thing I would like to say in terms of regional multilateralism from the Americas is that sometimes minilateralism and ad hoc multilateralism actually works. For example, when there was one major security interest in the region, which was the Central American conflict in the 1970s and 1980s, ad hoc multilateral efforts worked a little bit. They were not completely successful, but they did work. They did unite some of the Latin American countries, and collective action was, in a way, efficient. So I would not say that all multilateral efforts have to be either organizations or institutions or huge groups, but ad hoc multilateralism is also useful in a way. Even though they're not permanent, they can just solve specific problems, and that's okay. So I would have no single answer to the question of assessing multilateralism. If I had to generalize, I would say that the first lesson is there is no one single logic for multilateral efforts. We have to be open for different ways of shaping multilateral efforts, multilateral groups. Second, the second lesson I would draw from the 20th centuries is that it has succeeded when major powers have no divergent interests. And in this way, the 1990s would be, for example, in the case of the Organization of American States, the golden age of multilateralism. And I think I'm not entirely wrong if I say that it was, in general, a good decade for multilateral efforts. Even for the United Nations in the 1990s was a very good decade. And because and you know, the reason why this happened is because there were shared values and there were no major powers being obstacles to the work of multilateral efforts. And third, multilateralism works better when there are shared values and strong domestic institutions. And this is very important for the Latin American case, as I will say a bit later, and for other Global South countries. And the fourth element has been already said both by Adrian and by Rebecca. We have other actors, and we have to incorporate other actors, social actors, in multilateral efforts. I am a bit conservative in this way, and I think multilateralism has to have a strong presence of the state, but this should not mean excluding other actors. We have to be creative in the way we incorporate social actors, social organization, private initiative, epistemic communities, but there has to be some order and there have to be some regulations. And I think the state is important in this case. So I would say, yes, we need the state, but we also need to incorporate very successfully other actors. And in this, we have to be creative and we have to think different ways of making the coordination of all these actors successful. The second question, what are the changes in the global order that we need to increase the international system resilience? In this way, at the beginning, I didn't understand this question very well. And I thought, well, perhaps they're talking about improving governance. And if this is so, I think both Adriana and Rebecca have explored and have answered this question in a better way that I would. I would only like to add to what they have said in terms of great powers, in terms of multilateral efforts, regimes, institutions, organizations, I would only like to add a more active global south. We have to see the global south as also a contributor to new efforts. I don't mean to say that there is a homogeneous global south. There are different interests in the global south, there are different positions, different perspectives, but we need a global south that is more assertive and more demanding in terms of a more just global system. In all cases, there has to be more justice in terms of trade, environment, development, human rights, etc. So I would only like to say that we need a more active global south. And in terms of the third questions, perceptions, perspectives, the Atlantic Basin, I would again only speak from the Americas, and I would say first we need we need stronger domestic institutions. I think that Latin American regionalism, Latin American multilateralism will not work as long as domestic institutions are not more consolidated. Again, I come back to this discussion about supranational institutions. I think in the case of Latin America, the problem is not necessarily supranational institutions. If we have in our different countries stronger domestic institutions, that would be already something very constructive in terms of multilateralism. We have different presidents coming and going with very different ideologies. We have the reconstruction of the state with each new president. If this goes on, there is no way we're going to have good and successful multilateral efforts. So we need, first of all, stronger domestic institutions and, to the extent possible, shared values. If the Latin American countries do not have a minimum of shared values in terms of, I don't know, democracy, human rights, domestic governance, there is no way that multilateral efforts will succeed in the region. The second has already been said, incorporate other actors, social actors. The third, also Rebecca spoke about this, we need a committed United States. We need a committed United States with multilateralism, but a commitment that is respectful and that is responsible. Not only committed in the way, for example, it was committed in the 1960s in the OAS in terms of intervening and imposing agendas. We need a more responsible leader in the region and a more respectful leader in the region. And finally, and very linked to this issue, is the leadership subject that also Rebecca spoke about. We need leaders. If we don't have leaders, multilateral efforts will not work, I think. It can be the United States. It is a great power now. It is a regional power. It has been always the regional power in the Americas. But we also need other leaderships. Emerging countries, India, China. You know, sometimes we had Brazil in the region. You know, we can discuss whether it really was a leader or not. But we need leaders, and we need leaders that are not necessarily the great powers. And I think I will leave it there, and I will wait for the discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ana Rubios. I would like to remember the participants. If you wish to make some comments or questions, it's possible to do so through the chat on the platform. We have already a couple of questions that after the presentation of Dr. Christian, I'll be reading and posing for yourselves to respond. So now I would like, before passing the words to Dr. Christian Leroux, introduce him. He is the head of the Department of Agreements and Trade Negotiations in ALADI since 2018. Sorry. He provides legal advice on international trade negotiations, trade rules, disciplines, investment, trade in service, rule of origin, and RTA's notifications to WTO. Previously, he worked at the Ministry of Industry and Trade in Argentina and provided counsel to Director General on issues related to the Mercosur, WTO, and ALADI framework. He holds a law degree by the University of Belgrano in Argentina, a postgraduate diploma in international economy by the University of Barcelona in Spain, and a master in international relations, Europe, Latin America by the University of Bologna in Italy. Finally, he is a professor at the University of Montevideo in Uruguay and taught at different universities in Argentina. The floor is yours, Dr. Christian Leroux.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me to participate. Unfortunately, the Secretary General is busy now, and it's complicated, the agenda, but I will try to replace him as well. And thank you, Jean Monnet Atlantic Network, EU-LAC, CDOP, and Getulio Vargas Foundation. Well, I will try to focus my presentation on trade. I listened carefully the presentation and was very good ones, and I tried to do it on trade. That is my expertise. And I will say for the first questions, what were its major flaws and contributions? I will start with the contributions because before the Second World War and the post-war period, the world had a high level of protectionism and a tariff war. And the creation of GATT, the GATT rules, and the beginning of the modern international trade systems, I think that created positive effects on tariffs, subsidies, and liberalization of trade. And also they create and promotes rules to increase foreign direct investment and trade, and are leading to establishment WTO in 1994. If we consider the main values of WTO as a multilateral trading system, we can say a couple of questions. For example, the WTO, it governs almost 80% of the world trade. All RTAs, especially free trade agreements and regional trade agreements, are notified to the WTO at both committees, Committee of Trade and Development and Committee of Regional Trade Agreements. And those RTAs are based on WTO rulebook. So at least at the latest, we have 349 RTAs in force. So many are. It is a place where sovereign nations, 164 members, seek to find ways to cooperate each other for a mutual economic benefit. So it's a good space. And it's a forum in which you can set the rules for international trade, raise specific trade concerns to other countries, settle trade disputes. Rebecca mentioned a dispute settlement agreement or dispute settlement mechanism. And from another hand, or the other point, we have several flaws. I think one of the main flaws are the lack of advance, or the perception that the lack of advance or low speed in trade negotiations related especially to issues like, for example, intellectual property rights, trading services, investment. We don't have an investment framework or multilateral investment agreement. Digital economy, this is a new issue. Government procurement, because it's a plurilateral agreement. Agriculture, of course. Rules of origins. This is sometimes is chaotic, the rules of origin. And make multilateral trade system more relevant to and understandable, maybe for people. I mean, for a system that should be designed, for example, for farmers, workers, small and medium enterprises, and women as well. And increase regionalism, and maybe the flaw, the failure in some way, or perception of failure of international or multilateral trading system, increase regionalism in the worldwide, but especially under Article 24 of GATT, or enabling clause, and they create a lot of sub-regional mechanism of integration. For example, ALADI is one of them, Mercosur, Andean Community, NAFTA or USMCA, Pacific Islands, CARICOM. So we have a lot of them, CIECA in Central America. And for instance, in international investment agreement, we have a lot of BITs or bilateral investment treaties in the 90s, and we don't have a multilateral framework, and this is a very important thing. And of course, they create new initiatives, for example, ATISA in trading services. For the second question, what are the changes in the global order that would increase the international system resilience? I will say that it's important, from my point of view, to reinforcement the WTO system and to confront several challenges, because there are so many challenges ahead. For example, the rise of China. China is with a new trade, technology, and military power. So a multilateral institution should be necessary to level the playing field. And the presence of China and Russia in Latin America without a multilateral investment treatment. And fighting the pandemic, this is a new important issue. The new cooperation activities in health and trade. We need international organizations, maybe more accurate, dealing with three aspects to fighting the pandemic. For instance, assuring the flow across borders of vaccines, medicines, medical equipment to deal with the pandemic. The WTO, for example, we never had a working party of COVID-19. Accelerate the dispute settlement. Maybe we want to create, or we need to create a new appellate body, making the recovery greener and the climate change. Maybe there is a discussion on trade and environment, but we have to create or to think new policies to support maybe low carbon technology, reducing fossil fuels, dealing with food scarcity. Anyway, and maybe an e-commerce pact or e-commerce agreement. They start negotiations about e-commerce, but there is no pact as well. And maybe beginning with a great consolidation of regional trade agreements, especially into the WTO. Pandemic accelerate change in the economic system, digital economy, renewable energy. So it is important to deal with that. And the last questions, what are the perception and perspective as well as the contributions for the Atlantic Basin region in shaping a renewed global multilateral system? I think that we have a bi-regional trade agreements like Mercosur, European Union, Mercosur, SACU, South Africa Custom Union, SACU, and we have a chance to create more set of rules, common rules, no? And European, with Mercosur, for example, we have an agreement, a free trade agreement or bi-regional trade agreement. Mercosur, European Union and Mexico, European Union and Chile, European Union and CARIFORUM. So there are several rules that maybe should be the same, or maybe we have different issues or chapters of trade services that we can converge, make a convergence. And of course, I read a paper with Ayuso, and about CELAC and European Union, and maybe it should be a interesting point of view to renew or reshape the international cooperation between European Union and Latin America. And of course, ALADI is not new because we are in 1980s, but it's a space, a very good space for negotiate and convergence issues like investment, services, regulatory cooperation. We have 13 member countries, and we have it under the Montevideo Treaty, countries like Argentina, Mexico, Brazil, Cuba, Ecuador, and I think it's a good chance to improve and to accelerate negotiation and convergence. And I think the main challenge is substantial to progress on regulatory convergence, especially in issues which are fragmented. For example, investment, trading services, public procurement, digital economy, trade facilitation. And I think we have to do and to work more on this issue. But that's what I'm saying. Thank you.
Thank you, Christian. Now I will address to yourselves some questions that participants are sending. There are one here, actually two, that are interconnected, interlinked. I would start with the first one, posing for all of you, and feel free to respond, those who want to respond, to answer. Do you think that the post-COVID time will be a period marked by interregionalism or by intensification of states' multilateral commitments? In the case that is marked by interregionalism, this is the other link question. How can regionalism and interregionalism contribute to a institutional innovation for more inclusive multilateralism? It was possible to understand? So the first one asks if the period post-COVID-19 will be marked by the intensification of states' multilateral commitments or interregionalism. And how can interregionalism contribute to innovation for a more inclusive multilateralism? Who'd like to start? Anna, please. Go ahead.
Thank you. I'm afraid I don't have all the elements to answer completely the two questions, especially in the case of interregionalism. But I would only like to comment on what happened in the region, in the Americas, regarding COVID. Because what we saw was that the general multilateral effort, which is CELAC, the community of states, Latin American states, and the Caribbean, couldn't do anything really. The only efforts that were more or less successful in doing something, at least coordinate borders or trade or something, were SICA and CARICOM. I would leave, I'm not very sure about Mercosur, but I think all the states sort of, did what they had to do and did not have a common policy, but I may be wrong. I'm not really sure. But what we witnessed was a more unilateral policy. Every country just, trying to buy the vaccines on their own, and no common policy in terms of saying, we have to get together and do something to get the vaccines, to share the vaccines, etc. So my contribution would be, even within the region, multilateral efforts were not really successful, except for sub-regional efforts. And even in this case, were not entirely successful in the objective of getting the vaccines, which was really the major necessity. In terms of trade and borders, etc., there was more shared interests. And I'm not sure whether really, if we could not act multilaterally, it would be very difficult to even go beyond and have a relationship connecting two regions. Thank you.
Sorry, Adrian, please go ahead. Now it seems that you are mute. Not me.
Following the last reasoning made by Anna, I would like to point out that we have to see at the instruments, the current and real instruments of interregionalism in Latin America and the Caribbean, for example, or Europe. And what we have is a set of regimes founded 40 years ago. That is what we have. The real regimes ruling trade and everything are the Andean Community, Mercosur, SICA, CARICOM, those regimes that we are going to criticize every time, but those are the existing regimes. So if we are going to speak about interregionalism, we have to look at them. And if we look at the current crisis in Latin America and the Caribbean because of the pandemic, we have to look at a crisis which is not only of the contraction of global markets, but it is going to be a productive crisis. We were economies going to globalization with commodities, with the exception of Mexico, and other issues like oil or minerals, and those prices are going down. So we have to look at the production, because this crisis is going to endure for about 10 years at least. And we have to look at those regimes. If we are going to speak on interregionalism, we have to look at those regimes. And after that, we can look at the relationships between Latin America, the Caribbean, and other regions of the world. And in that sense, we can have a more strategic perspective, of course. And yes, of course, the polarization between Beijing and Washington is not good for the Latin American interests and the Caribbean ones, and it is not good also for the interests of the European countries. And yes, it is, as Ana Ayuso is telling us, it is important to revitalize our relationships in order to elude the geopolitical tensions between the US and China, because if we don't do something about that, we are going to take one side. We look at the Cold War, it was a different polarization, of course, but that was not convenient for Latin America and the Caribbean, and was not convenient for the European countries. So we have to meet both regions, and we have to meet trying to look at the current, real, existing interregional regimes in both regions, the European Union, of course, and the sub-regional regimes in Latin America and the Caribbean.
Thank you, Adrian. Indeed, okay, you already responded the other question posed by Ana Ayuso about the cooperation between both of the regions and within these tensions among US and China. But I see that Rebecca raised her hands. Please go ahead, Rebecca.
Thank you. I just wanted to make a comment then about this unilateralism on the one hand and then multilateral solutions on the other hand. I think that in this context of post-pandemic politics and cooperation, I think we will see both unilateral drives for assisting countries in need, also talking about then vaccine diplomacy. Now, for instance, Mexico has sent vaccines to Central American countries. So we have on the one hand then a continuation of vaccine diplomacy because it satisfies domestic interests. And on the other hand, I think we also will see this expansion of multilateral initiatives to then help mitigating the economic and social effects of the pandemic. And that taking place then through, for instance, CELAC or other regional organizations. And Mexico, for instance, there, when it held the pro tempore presidency of CELAC last year, then it was instrumental in fostering good ties with the Japanese government, with JICA, for instance. So there came a big supply of personal protective equipment that then CELAC could distribute to Caribbean countries. So that is an example of how then both through a multilateral mechanism that then Mexico was acting as a representative of CELAC. And on the other hand, we also saw then, of course, unilateral and specific initiatives by the Mexican government and based on its own foreign policy priorities. So there's also issue linkages, I think, that is very important to take into consideration on the part of individual countries, but there's also then issue linkages both in the multilateral context and in then the specific foreign policy of certain states towards then other countries in their immediate vicinity. I don't know if I made myself clear, but I think that the answer is both and in a way.
Thank you, Rebecca. I have here another question by Mark Spinwall. The EU committed itself to effective multilateralism in its European security strategy some years ago. Is there any evidence of effective multilateralism in its relations with Latin America? Adrian?
Yes, I only can say that there is no other way in order to connect the two regions that multilateralism as a policy. And we have had in the past these meetings of the governments of Latin America, the Caribbean, Europe since 12, 13 years ago. And we have a lot of documents and a lot of common policies, beginning, for example, with a common space of higher education. And right now, just in December, we have a very important meeting between the ministers of foreign relations of both regions. And they made resolutions about COVID. They made resolutions about digital transfer of knowledge between the both regions. And social policies, also about environmental issues. So there is no other way of relationship between Europe and the region. It has to be multilateral. There is no bilateral relations between two regions. And yes, the European Union has a lot of bilateral relations with the Latin American, Caribbean, and countries of other regions. But if you are going to put together two regions, multilateralism is the only possibility.
Yes, just remember that a couple of days ago, the EU also launched a new statement about gathering together countries for discussing a treaty on preparedness for future pandemics. And of course, this partnership between both of the region is very important because they in total gather 62 countries, which is 1/3 of the UN. And this is one of the main outcomes that could make it possible the Paris Agreement in the case of the climate change. So yes, please, Christian would like to tell us something. Yes.
Yeah, I like to add something. An very interesting point that Dr. Adrian Bonilla told us, and I think it's important to understand and to improve a progressive multilateralism inside the Latin American region, because we have sub-regional mechanism agreement like Mercosur, Andean Community, Pacific Alliance, and CARICOM, CIECA, CELA, and we have another free trade agreements that is not a regional mechanism, but if you stay the NAFTA or USMCA, and we don't have a common set of rules. And I think it is important for Latin America to work and to deal to progressive multilateralism about issues like, for example, government procurement. We don't have an agreement on government procurement in the region, so it was very difficult to negotiate government procurement with the EU. I participated in one of the negotiations too many years ago. But another issue, very, very important, is to get a multilateral investment agreement. We have a fragmentation in investment. We have a lot of foreign direct investment, but we have a lot of BITs, bilateral investment treaties, with controversial investment state dispute settlement, with inclusion of mechanism for arbitration like exit, for example, in the region. And we don't have, for example, the European Union and Canada, the CETA agreement, creates a new mechanism with seems like an appellate body for international investment dispute. And I think we have to create a common rules of origin in order to facilitate the entrepreneurs and small and medium enterprises. We have an agreement and clear rules on small and medium enterprise to improve exports, and maybe we have to work together. And for example, for instance, Mercosur and Pacific Islands, they are working on an agenda. So maybe about regulatory cooperation, and maybe this is one way to start. But for instance, we have an agreement with the European Union and Mercosur, and we have an agreement with European Union and Chile, Mexico, Peru, Colombia, Ecuador. So, but we negotiate the same trade rule disciplines. So maybe we can multilateralize this kind of disciplines, and maybe to analyze what are the offers. For example, if Argentina offers something to European Union, what offer Ecuador, Peru, no? And maybe to work a multilateral or progressive multilateralization of trade disciplines. So maybe when we create some space and multilateralize inside the region, maybe it's more clear to talk with the European Union. And maybe it's clear for the European Union to talk with Latin America, because Latin America is fragmented now with such a lot of subregional mechanisms. So it's quite difficult. And maybe one possibility is the relationship between European Union and CELAC. But CELAC, the last summit was in 2020, I think. But maybe we have to think trade issues inside CELAC, and this is, I think, is quite complicated to start on bi-regional agreements, but we need to put in order the Latin American region before that. But this is my point of view, of course.
Thank you, Christian.
Sure, thank you.
There is one maybe last question here before we close, which is from Leonardo Paz from Fundação Getúlio Vargas. Assuming that democracy and the liberal order are in retreat, or at least in defensive in many countries, I would say under threat, but anyway, especially in the Western Hemisphere, how this phenomenon affects multilateral process. I would also amend this question saying that in the context of, because one context is the global multipolar scenario that we are now having, but within each country, we are having a very polarized society, political polarized society, as we are witnessing every day in elections. So how yourselves do you see this could affect the multilateral process? This issue about the threats that some democracies are facing in the Western Hemisphere, alongside this very dramatic, polarized political process within countries, not within the global order. Rebecca or Anna, who would like to start? It's challenging. Go ahead, Anna.
It is. I can only say what we have witnessed in the last years, and I would say that it does affect the multilateral process very much. And we only need to see what has been happening regarding Venezuela in Latin America, and then we can see that there is no consensus in the other countries about what to do regarding Venezuela. We have the OAS, we have the Lima Group, we have ECLAC or CELAC, and in the case of CELAC, for example, when the Mexican government assumed the pro tempore presidency, they depoliticized the agenda precisely not to deal with these issues. Venezuela and probably Nicaragua later. And the OAS, well, there has been different positions. The Secretary General with one very assertive and aggressive position, and some countries supporting that, others having a completely different position. And then the Lima Group has sort of faded in a way. So I think that if we look at multilateralism in Latin America in the last years of the 20th century, except for the 1990s decade, and at the beginning of the 21st century, we will see that the absence of minimum common values in terms of democracy, human rights, and free trade has done a lot of damage to the multilateral efforts. We had Brazil on the one side not wanting to accept the US leadership in terms of free trade, of all the Americas free trade area. And then we had Mexico first supporting democracy and human rights very much, and then changing completely its position. So I think if there is no minimum consensus, then multilateral efforts would not be effective regarding security and political issues, as you say, as we can see now, very polarized in terms of democracy or non-democracy. And I also think that we have to reflect and rethink what we mean by democracy and the defense and protection of human rights, and not take only the Western model as such. We have to discuss. These are topics that we need to discuss. But there is no discussion, and there is no consensus. So I think as long as there is no minimum consensus, it will be very difficult to deal with these issues in the region. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna. Rebecca, please.
I'd like to thank Anna for an excellent comment. I think really summarizing nicely then the dilemmas, no? And I think she was very right on several issues. So I think that also, yes, we will see more of this thin coating of liberal values, no? The idea of liberal democracy will coexist with other ways of looking at legitimacy and representation between then state leaders and their citizens, but also then how that translates into then multilateral negotiations and the call for multi-stakeholder participation. For instance, what's in a name, no? Is this really relevant participation by non-state actors or not, no? So I think we will see more of a thin coating of liberal values. And I also think that, unfortunately, more of this pragmatic stance will affect negatively then the quality of democracy at home. No, if we're talking about the lack of solid institutions, no, we are talking perhaps about then an even greater uphill struggle then for those groups in society who would like to see more of openness, transparency, accountability on the part of their own policymakers. No, it would be even more difficult than to ask for that to be visible at a multilateral in a multilateral setting. No? Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Rebecca. Well, we have 5 minutes more. Maybe there is a last question here. What's the role of initiatives such as the Alliance for Multilateralism, led by Germany and France, to the international multilateral system? Do they duplicate state-based efforts or complement them? So please feel free. This is, I know that most of you are from academia, so anyway, no problem, but this is Chatham House as well. So you can comment on, well, just Christian is from an international and Adrian organization. But if you'd like to comment on this initiative led by these two countries and whether this can sum or duplicate or overlap other state-based efforts. Adrian?
I think the answer is very simple. They are no new multilateral initiatives. They are policies destined to foster multilateralism and to foster the relationships of Europe with other countries and other regions. So we don't have a duplication because we don't have new multilateral organizations. We have new policies. That's it.
Perfect. Well, I would like to thank all of your panelists for this great panel. Indeed, we have to continue this program for today. In 15 minutes, there will be a second panel that will be dedicated to regional visions in the fight against climate change and the path to COP26. So thank you very much, Dr. Ana Covarrubias, Dr. Rebecca Ulfgaard, Dr. Christian and Dr. Adrian Bonilla for your excellent interventions and a very fruitful debate. And see you soon. And maybe in a couple of weeks or months, we will have a publication with the main messages and topics that we have discussed here, that we are going to get together with the discussions that will come from the other panels of this joint initiative by the EUL-LAC Foundation and the Atlantic Network 2.0 and colleagues from CDOB, Fundação Getúlio Vargas, and others. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks.
Bye.
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 Hello.
Hello. Can you hear
Can
me?
you hear me? Yes.
Oh, great.
Welcome. Welcome to the second panel of the webinar, Atlantic Approaches to Global Challenges. This is a webinar organized by the Jean Monnet Atlantic Network 2.0, with, in this case, the collaboration of the EUL-LAC Foundation. In the first panel, we had just 1 hour ago, or 1 hour and a half ago, we had been discussing the challenges of the multilateralism in the 21st century in general. And now we enter on one of the great challenges facing by the planet, that is the fight to stop climate change. Before the COVID-19 pandemic, the climate crisis was already one of the great challenges, but now it is not a challenge. It still is a challenge, or a still more important challenge, but it also become an opportunity to post a new recovery with more sustainability. So with that, and with the return of the United States to the Paris Agreement, the initiatives to take some measures have been accelerating. And we have in next month the COP26 to be held in Glasgow after to be postponed due to the COVID-19. And in this summit, will be the moment when all the countries that are committed to the fight against climate change will make their proposals to achieve the goals, to stop or at least to mitigate the climate change. So in this session, we want to analyze how the different regions of the Atlantic see the challenges of this summit. First, we want to know what are the goals they will commit to, or they are to propose to commit. Second, with which resources and projects are they planning to achieve these objectives, these goals? And finally, we want to address also what kind of alliances can be made in the Atlantic space to generate cooperation between the different regions and countries of the Atlantic Basin. So to do that, we have the participation of 4 recruited specialists from different regions of the Atlantic. We have first in the program Dan Hamilton. Hi, Dan. He's director of the Global Europe Program and distinguished fellow at the Woodrow Wilson Center, and he will offer the view from the United States with this new impetus that the President Biden started with this mandate. Second, we have Jacob Bergsman. He is principal advisor for the international aspects of the European Union climate policy at the DG for Climate Action, the European Commission. So he will give us which are the proposals of from the European Union. We have also with us Isabel Teixeira. She has been Ministry of Environment of Brazil from 2010 to 2016. So he has a long experience in policies to fight climate change, but now is co-chair of the United Nations International Panel of Natural Resources, and also she acts as senior fellow on climate change and the environment at the FEBRI, I think tank based in Brazil. And we have also from Africa, Professor Landry Signet. He's senior director and professor at the Thunderbird School of Global Management, and he's also senior fellow at the Policy Center for the New South. So we have these 4 visions. We want to exchange ideas and initiatives. And I ask you to do a brief speech of 15 minutes, each one. And then we will move to the debate with the questions of the public. The public can do the question, post the questions during the expositions by the YouTube channel, the chat of the YouTube channel, and I will pass the questions to the panelists. So we start now already with Dan Hamilton, following the program. Dan, Joe Biden started his term with big changes in the policy on regarding climate change. He has not only returned to the Paris Agreement, but he wants to lead initiatives. He also made this global climate summit 2 months ago. Can you tell us about the plans of Joe Biden for the COP26?
Thank you, Anna. It's a pleasure to see you again and all our colleagues. Yes, so, Joe Biden is really moving forward on climate. Our political process is such that his full team still isn't even in place yet. So how exactly the U.S. will engage this fall is still, a work in progress. But I think it's important for maybe non-Americans to get a sense of, how quickly and on what all the fronts that this administration is moving in terms of climate change. As you mentioned, on day one, he rejoined the Paris Climate Agreement. He announced John Kerry as a special climate envoy with cabinet rank. He took, in the United States, a series of executive actions, sort of canceling the Keystone Pipeline, reversing many Trump administration policies, ending, the Trump administration was opening up drilling on federal territories. He ended that, a whole set of environmental regulations that are already in place. As you mentioned, he hosted then a climate summit with 40 world leaders to try to put pressure on many to up their commitments and to in fact announce new ambitious U.S. commitments. U.S. goal of reducing emissions by over half by 2030 compared to 2005 levels, and to move by mid-century to the net zero emission economy. At home in the United States, the Biden administration is moving quickly on a clean energy economic development program that is also about creating jobs, and their approach is really to embed climate issues within a broader projection of sort of retooling, reinvigorating the U.S. economy. Most projections show that even if countries are moving to net zero and all this, they're still not going to make it in time unless some key countries really do much more. And so the Biden administration has reinvigorated initiative that was started by George W. Bush, the Major Economies Forum. So in addition, this is 17 major economic powerhouses of the world that account for 80% of global emissions and also 80% of global GDP. And if those countries, those 17, can up their commitments and ambition, that'll take much of the world further toward this goal. So it's not just about having everybody on board, but having some key players really lead the way. But the administration is moving on lots of different fronts that may be escaping some attention. So there's a global climate ambition initiative, they call it, between USAID, so our development agency, and the State Department to work with developing countries to provide technical assistance and other kinds of assistance to help them meet their climate goals. The U.S. International Development Finance Corporation, which is our major government-led finance initiative, has set a goal of net zero investment profile by 2040. That means no investments that aren't net zero in terms of impact. That's the earliest target of any G7 or G20 development finance institutions. So the U.S. is leading in that area. And starting in 2023, 1/3 of all the investments made through that corporation will be climate related. They've partnered with the Rockefeller Foundation to also provide climate technical assistance facility also to developing countries and to roll that out as fast as they can. Another institution on the U.S. side is the Millennium Challenge Corporation. And the commitment there is 50% climate-related investment in the next 5 years, a completely coal-free policy, and to invest in low-carbon economic development. So once you start to look through these different initiatives, this is starting to amount to billions and billions of dollars of investment. There's another initiative that the U.S. is chairing with Canada, called the Greening Government Initiative. This is trying to make government procurement, anything to do with federal government activities, zero emission vehicle fleet, for instance, government-owned vehicles, and to move to 100% clean electricity. So that's a grouping that's open to others to join. The U.S. and Canada are chairing it. Another one is from the US-EU Summit, that was just held recently, that the U.S. and the EU have realigned again now on many climate goals. I think the most interesting to me of the summit was a commitment to work on sustainable finance, to try to create metrics for companies to understand how to assess climate risk, and to move in that whole area linking finance and green growth and climate issues, where the US and the EU now together will be doing a lot of things. Another group that's been set up is the Net Zero Producers Forum. This is oil and gas producers around the world, US, Canada, Norway, Qatar, Saudi Arabia. Those countries alone produce 40% of the world's oil and gas. They've agreed on a methane abatement effort, on working on circular carbon economy measures, and on carbon capture and storage. So the producers are starting some activity. The US has also reached out to India and created a climate and clean energy agenda partnership with India to help India achieve its climate goals. And it is engaged in sort of reviving technical assistance for what's called the renewable energy for Latin America and the Caribbean. So this is an initiative spearheaded by Colombia, Chile, and Costa Rica. The goal is to get to 70% renewable energy by 2030. And the U.S. is now rejoining into that initiative and helping southern neighbors in that area. There's also a large investment now and attention by the Biden administration to the transportation sector to basically fundamentally change transportation. They've created a zero emission vehicle transition council to the car producers of the world, committing to move to net zero emissions, and also to reduce emissions in other transportation areas like international shipping and aviation. So those are all going forward. Many of those are sort of coalitions of the willing, or if you will, or they're variable geometry frameworks in which other countries could join those. They're not intended to be exclusive. As I mentioned, the Biden administration approach is trying to integrate climate into economic recovery and revitalization. And there is something they call the Empowering People Initiative that's being done with the European Union, Canada, and Chile, again, to talk about transition for jobs and how people will need to transition from certain kinds of employment to others. There's also a major focus on innovation. The Biden administration is quadrupling, so 4 times, clean energy investment innovation funding from the Trump administration's levels. There is an initiative they call Mission Innovation, which is going to be, there's a technological mission to that on reducing carbon dioxide that will be announced and released at the COP26 events in Glasgow. There's a related agricultural innovation mission that also will be unveiled at COP26 on reducing carbon emission from the agricultural sector. There is a great attention here on a just transition, on environmental justice and climate resilience for underserved and vulnerable communities in North America and in the Arctic, including indigenous communities. The U.S. has created a new forum with island nations to work with the most vulnerable islands that are under tremendous threat, and an initiative on clean cook stoves. As much, household cooking releases temporary but bad for the climate emissions, especially in Africa, to try to address that. And then there is a $1 billion initiative working with countries to reduce emissions from forests as well. And then the initiative that both the US and the EU announced at their summit on protecting 30% ocean and land. That's a very ambitious agenda for an administration that's only been in office for less than 6 months. and with the whole team not even there. It doesn't reflect what's happening across the United States, that many U.S. states, of the 50 states, many of those states are engaged in their own efforts and never in fact stopped adhering to the Paris protocols and everything. Despite the Trump administration, they moved ahead anyway. Many mayors and cities are doing something as well. The challenge will be that this is very uneven politically. Some states are resisting much of this. Some cities are resisting in certain parts of the United States. And in the U.S. Congress, it is a very divided Congress between Republicans and Democrats, with only one vote separating them in the U.S. Senate and only a handful of votes in the U.S. House of Representatives. So initiatives that will require congressional approval, especially any treaty, would be very difficult in the United States right now. And our next, test will be a year from November, when we have midterm elections for the entire House of Representatives and 1/3 of the U.S. Senate, to see whether the Democrats retain their majority or not. If the Biden administration has to deal with a divided Congress for the last 2 years of its term, that'll make much of this even more difficult. So you see the president is trying to do what he can, as President Obama did, through many executive actions, presidential actions through the executive branch. That only gets you so far, because to really anchor this, you need this to be anchored by congressional support. So that's the ongoing battle in the United States. But so far, this has been very ambitious. It's full, it's an all fronts, all hands on deck effort to show the United States is back in the climate game, and as you said, also intends to lead in these issues. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan. A very impressive agenda, as you said. Now we will see what happens with the European Union. We know that we have great initiatives like for the green recovery, like the Green Deal. But what are the initiatives at the international level, and how is the EU going to contribute to the COP26? Jacob?
Thanks very much, Anna. Can you hear me well?
Yes.
Oh, great. Well, greetings from Brussels, and thanks very much for the opportunity to join such a distinguished panel, and also in particular to follow on a colleague from the US presenting the view from the other side of the Atlantic. I can't say how much pleasure it gives me to be able to follow a presentation reflecting what the current administration is doing after many years of not being able to see much progress happening on the US side, and to move into what I think will be much more of a virtuous competition, a lot of cooperation as well, but virtuous competition between the EU and the US for the mantle of leadership on climate action. So this is the year where we're preparing for Glasgow and COP26, and you asked generally, what are the EU's goals? What is the international community's goals with regard to COP26? And I think here the US and the EU are very much aligned with many countries around the world in trying to make sure that COP26 delivers political announcements, political commitments, political statements that enable us to argue to the public that we've kept the goals of the Paris Agreement within reach. And in particular, when we talk about these goals, we talk about the goal of avoiding dangerous climate change, and in particular, ensuring that we're collectively on a pathway to preventing a global average temperature rise of 1.5 degrees. That's what we're trying to do. COP26 is a very strange COP. It's been made stranger by COVID, which means that in effect, we've had 2 years to prepare for this event in November of this year. Originally, Glasgow was going to happen in November of last year. And that means we have to look at the achievements of Glasgow and the pressure that it's building for more ambition, not just in terms of what happens in this coming November, but what happened over the course of the past 2 years. So there are a number of parties to the Paris Agreement, including the EU and the United States, that already have announced their major contributions to Glasgow, which is raising the level of the initial target that they set for themselves in the Paris Agreement to a higher and more ambitious level. The EU originally had a target of at least 40% emissions reduction from 1990 levels by 2030. And as a result of the growing science, the science base, the evidence base, the call from the European public to take more action, and of course the feeling of an international responsibility to lead on climate change, we have since 2015 raised that target from an at least 40% target to an at least 55% emissions reduction from 1990 levels by 2030. At the same time, we've made a political and now legal commitment to ensure that the European economy is net zero in terms of its emissions of all greenhouse gases by 2050. And we see that as putting the EU on a pathway towards contributing to reaching that 1.5 degree Paris goal, to avoiding dangerous climate change. And we're trying to use that leadership, that commitment that we've made domestically to inspire others to follow suit. I won't go into a very long catalog, of which it would be, of everything that the EU is doing in order to achieve those goals. But to say that the domestic policy that we have in place now is really on the basis of a very broad support from the European public to take action on climate change. I think a broad understanding of what the science says in terms of what we have to do, but also in terms of what the science says if we don't do what we have to do, in terms of the impacts that climate change will have on the European public, the European environment, the European economy. It's really a deeply embedded understanding now. And we saw that in the results of the most recent European election at the end of last year, which produced the greenest European Parliament ever. And by green, I don't mean the Green Party being particularly represented, but that across all of the spectrum of the European political parties, a support for more climate action on behalf of the EU. And that's what led to the appointment of the European Commission that has as its manifesto what you referred to, the European Green Deal, and that contains these very ambitious targets in terms of reducing emissions, but also ambitious environmental targets across a wide spectrum of actions, including the protection of biodiversity, the creation of a more circular economy where we're effectively reducing wastes and plastics in our economy, and many other objectives as well, including greening our agricultural sector. What I can say, rather than cataloging each element of this, is to say that broad political support has been building in the EU for more than 2 decades now, and has resulted in a very, very stable set of climate policies. And maybe this is where we can contrast what's been happening in the United States, where from each administration we've been hearing different messages, whether it's with regard to the Kyoto Protocol, the Framework Convention, or the Paris Agreement. In the EU, you see a steady building of domestic policies that have put us on a pathway towards reducing our emissions. And this includes a legally binding, at the European law level, cap and trade system that requires all the regulated entities within that system to reduce their emissions according to a clearly defined schedule of emissions reductions. So it gives us certainty in terms of the pathways that we're moving, but also uses a market-based system to allow those entities to trade emissions reductions to ensure that they're achieving those results in as cost-effective manner as possible. So that's a key element that's been a part of European policy for more than a decade now, that generates what we call a carbon price, and that sends a clear signal to the European economy, the actors within it, consumers, producers, shareholders, that they have to begin to align their economic choices with a low carbon pathway if they're going to remain within the boundaries of European climate policy. That is shored up by renewable energy policies, energy efficiency policies, efforts to significantly reform our transportation sector to move it towards zero emissions, and also increasingly to attack emissions from our building sector as well, as well as the way in which we manage our agricultural productivity, our forests, and our lands. So it really is an all-of-an-economy approach, but one that builds year on year on a consistent investment in designing the policies effectively and actually implementing them in reality. So from that, there are a couple of characteristics of European policy that we like to share. One is that it's science-driven. The targets that we set for ourselves, whether it's net zero or the 2030 target of at least 55, or the 2040 target that we've already committed to developing in the next couple of years, they're all based on what the latest science tells us we must do, and what the latest economics tells us that we can do. These policies are then embedded deeply within our legal system. So a change in administration, whether it's within an individual member state or within the Commission, does not change that trajectory, because the member states have bound themselves to those rules, and the policies are in place to achieve that. So all of this is supported by implementing legislation, the details of which in their latest incarnation will begin to be rolled out in quite a high level of specificity in July of this year with what we call the Fit for 55 package, which will describe how it is that the EU will be achieving that more ambitious target of at least 55% emissions reductions by 2030. So a lot of the details in terms of the reform of our emissions trading system, the strengthening of renewable energy and energy efficiency targets, et cetera, will be announced as Commission's proposals in July, and then taken forward into the legislative process within the EU. A key aspect of European climate policy as well has been a strong focus on the transition that we're undergoing being a just transition. So that means sharing out the effort of reducing our emissions across different member states that have different GDPs per capita, have different strengths in terms of what they can contribute, have different basis for their energy systems that need to be reformed. And so with each new target we set for ourselves, we allocate and share that effort across the EU. We also have established just transition funds, innovation funds, modernization funds that collect resources together within the EU and share those resources out to make sure that no household, no community, no member state is left behind in terms of this ambitious effort that we're making for ourselves. This essential core of policies that I've just described, as I said, have been put in place consistently over the years, but they've also survived some very dramatic tests, in particular, the test of the COVID crisis, where we saw the European Union's economy, as well as the economies of countries around the world, being significantly impacted by COVID and the economic shutdown that came with COVID. And when we were asked to design a policy that could help us to recover, we turned to these basic design principles that I just described and found that they also provided the answers of the way in which the European Union seeks to recover from the COVID crisis. So nearly everything that we've decided as priorities for recovering from COVID have perfectly aligned with our efforts to green our economy, to promote that just transition that I just referred to through increasing investments in ensuring that our economy is low carbon, but also innovative and competitive. You asked about what our goals were, what our plans were, and what our alliances are. I mentioned our goals, and we're hoping that the goals that we set will inspire others. I mentioned our plans in terms of implementation, and we're hoping to hear, as we've just done, but in even greater detail as the months go on, from the United States, but also from other major economies that really hold the key to whether or not we'll reach those 1.5 degree goals, what their plans are. It's absolutely essential that goals are followed up by specific policies. And we'll be looking to our partners for specific examples of that. And on the basis of that, we expect more and more alliances to grow internationally. Whether it's in the kinds of areas that David just mentioned, increasing the global capacity to innovate in new areas, such as green hydrogen, such as improving the capacity of our electricity systems to store energy that's gathered from the sun and the wind, whether it's looking at ways in which we can enhance nature-based solutions to ensure that we are capturing carbon and storing it in a way that enhances nature's natural ability to carry out that function, but also to protect biodiversity. There are many kinds of alliances that will form, and we believe will form more rapidly and more productively as more and more countries commit to achieving this net zero goal of avoiding dangerous climate change. This year has been one of many positive announcements from many countries. And I think that the G7 commitment to net zero, to transformation, has been particularly impressive. But we have to see how that will play out with regard to the balance of the major economies, including through the grouping of the G20 that includes not just the G7 richest countries, but also the balance of the major economies, to see whether they will also be prepared to sign up to commit to do more in time for Glasgow. And that's one of the reasons that I'm so keen to hear more from other colleagues on the panel, including Minister Teixeira and Professor Signé, to maybe get a broader perspective of than just the EU and the US, but what we're seeing from the more industrializing countries around the world. So let me stop there, and looking forward to the discussion to come.
Thank you, Chaco. Yes, we go now to the other side of the Atlantic, now to the south. Isabella Teixeira. Latin America is a continent very vulnerable to the climate change, especially vulnerable, and but at the same time have a rich biodiversity. It's one of the richest parts of the world with in this biodiversity. So, what Latin America expect from COP26, and what initiatives are going to be launched or presented during the next months?
Oh, thank you very much. This is really a complex question because I try, first of all, to have a big picture here to illustrate the difference that we have among us, consider Latin American and Caribbean countries. And of course, I do apologize that I will try to highlight some points considered South America. But I'd like, first of all, greetings from Brazil, okay? And I'm very happy to have the opportunity to join you today. And it's amazing to see what the United States is doing today. And also, I do hope that Brazil would be back in 2023 for climate world. And also, the European Union keeps pushing the agenda, consider the green spot scattering, so can I use this expression? And used to have really robust partnership, not only between Brazil and the South American, Latin American countries considered America, United States, but also with European countries. So I do believe that we need to understand better what the challenge that Paris Agreement imposed for developing economies, meaning the South American, Latin American countries. We cannot forget that Paris Agreement implementation, it's not only new global challenges, it's also a big challenge for climate governance. We need to understand better how we should raise ambition, while with high evidence-based action is consider the asymmetries that we have, for example, in science in developing countries, or regional assessments with critical scenarios, and also tools that the developing world, or South America, Latin American countries can use this better than only the global scientific analysis. Also, we need to highlight that we here in this region, you have important ecosystems that are absolutely critical for climate stability, like Amazon forest, and also, for example, water resource, the case of our not only Amazon Basin, but also River Basin, and then you have, Plata Basin, you have really a big challenge to conciliate things, consider the demands for development, and also to fight against social inequalities. Of course, that is mentioned, you have we have really natural resource assets. They are absolutely important to understand the role of natural resource management and how we can use this as a bridge to push together biodiversity conservation and tackle climate change. Also, we cannot forget that we are, of course, exposed to adaptation demands, consider climate adaptation agenda, and this is a region that has not only rural demands, but also urban ecosystems play important role in this agenda. So, as I mentioned before, only to have a big picture, when you go into climate governance, the first point of view is that you don't have a coordinated agenda in Latin America consider climate ambition. Even the South America, or even, for example, in Amazon region, and you have 8 countries that share the biomes, and you don't have a coordinated perspective or vision, how these regions would like to move into the Paris Agreement implementation, what are the issues that you like to address, and how climate security would play, what's our role or responsibility to play climate security at the global level. So this lack of a strategy of regional climate narrative, it is very important, and it's reflected when you have different political constituency groups that these countries, they are part of. So you have ABU, for example, Brazil, Africa, Argentina, and Uruguay, that used to play together, and this is a new group that was established in 2016. But you go also to EUL-LAC, Independent Alliance of Latin America and the Caribbean. It's a more progressive behavior consider climate agenda. When you go into Bolivia and Ecuador, they are like-minded group of developing countries. And you have, of course, G77 plus China. And you go, all of them are part of this. But you have also Brazil as part of BASIC, Brazil, Africa, South Africa, India, and China. And you have G20, as mentioned before, other alliances that would be very important to Paris Agreement implementation. So this is very important to observe, that to have different players, different constituents that go into these groups and looking for to address national interests, but not necessarily have this put in the same page as a common understanding of a regional approach, how we face the challenge that climate change imposes to us. Also, cannot forget that biodiversity plays an important role. This is a political pressure role, okay? You have not only indigenous people, traditional communities, but you have scientists, and you have this new agenda that's coming of demand, considering the necessity or the need to have a new relationship between humanity and nature. So for us, Brazil, for example, is U1 in biodiversity, and you have one side of the coin, Atlantic forest, and another one, you have Amazon forest, and you have also other biomes that's so important, considered not only biodiversity like Cerrado, but also carbon storage. So how you promote things come together? Why? Because land use agenda is key for climate ambition in that region. It's not only energy, as that's the agenda that put pressure on developed economies. For us, it's absolutely critical that you can have innovative arrangement and bring land, biodiversity, and climate. Why? Because agriculture and forest sectors play an important role for our economy, for our regional development, and also for global food security. So, and it'll have, of course, energy, renewable energy. Brazil, for example, has the lowest marginal cost of solar and wind energy in the world today. But the other side of the coin, you have the dispute of oil and gas industry, mainly based on the natural gas. This is the case of Argentina to bring together Vaca Muerta reserves, or even Brazil with pre-salt, and the contradictions or disputes or the trade-offs that to have put the oil and gas industry put pressure on this, and also the other side, how we improve our performance in renewable energy. It's very important to understand how the short-term perspectives puts pressure today on medium and long-term perspectives. In Brazil, it's absolutely clear that to have, as I mentioned, this competitive arrangement that we achieve based on the public policy in the last 15 years, that you can manage our energy mix that's around 50% based on renewable energy, but you have pressure today, for example, for National Congress to put the coins on the basket of natural gas. So these are important contradictions to understand the short-term perspective, the short-term interests that put pressure, not only in Brazil, Argentina, as I mentioned before, and other countries in Latin America. The case of Mexico with black carbon, etc., etc., etc. So it's absolutely important also to consider social inequalities agenda. You have it is a crucial issue. When you mention just and fair transition, for example, what's happened today, a just transition in the United States, as mentioned by Don, we come here. It's impressive when you compare, for example, in going Amazon region, that everyone wants to discuss Amazon region, but forget, for example, in Brazil, that only Brazil have 25 million people that live in the Amazon region. 8% of this population live in cities. And then you go into the Human Development Index, we have the lowest rates of human development in Brazil, exactly in the Amazon region. So how indeed do we bring the debate of climate stability, regional development requirements, inclusive development, poverty eradication, etc., moving this situation and bring this in the climate security agenda and promote sustainable development. This is the big challenge that we have today, for example, in Brazil and also for Amazon countries. And it's a good example of how the importance of subnational level players when you have a negationist government like we have today in Brazil. So the governors of Amazon region will launch next July 16, a green recovery plan for that region. This is a good news because they are managing to move forward considering climate change independently of the contradictions that we have today from the federal government in Brazil. How this will influence the regional countries that are part of Amazon Basin, this is not clear enough. Okay, but we are looking for civil society, private sector, other players, and science to come together and to influence the other countries to understand better how, as Colombia has initiative, other ones, but Bolivia doesn't have this, etc., how we can indeed influence this country to look forward to this ambitious agenda and to try to address in this decade until 2030 some consensus, some convergences of common interests that we should address. Finally, we cannot forget the role of infrastructure in this agenda. Infrastructure is absolutely critical to address climate agenda. Why? Because we have gaps of infrastructure, and if you want to promote investments, if you want to influence the decision process, we need investments on infrastructure, but you need to bring low carbon infrastructure for this, not only the digital but physical infrastructure. This is a clear arrangement that you can come together to influence, to have ambition, short-term perspective, consider this transition until 2030. And of course, you cannot forget the role of the forest in the case of Amazon region, considering the disruptive process. If you still maintain deforestation, we need to stop deforestation. For example, for the risks to emergence of new pandemics or new pandemics, consider the zoonoses that will be exposed. The disruptive process of ecological cycle, when you go into deforestation, as international, the organization, the UN Wealth Organization shows, you have risks with vulnerability that will expose to the humanity new risk considered climate and biodiversity disruptive process. So it's very important to understand how this picture that to have not only based on threats, but also based in dynamics that you have in this region, how indeed you can try to have new arrangements or new alliance or regional alliance in such a way that you can push these countries closer. And for this, you had leadership in the South America, you had in the past Brazil, and also in the other side of the coin, Mexico. They are today you have Chile playing an important role. They are really progressive in this. Chile is really progressive today, consider the climate ambition. But when you compare indices, when you go to compare indices and you go to check indices, you have some trick situations. For example, because when you check Brazil, you have reduction in our emissions. It's very important to observe. Okay, but the other side of the coins, we presented in 2015 the more ambition indices in the world, and today we even consider the update of NDC. The scenarios means that Brazil will offer not raise ambition. Brazil probably with the number we have setbacks consider Brazil ambition. When you go into Ecuador, for example, you have no quantified targets. When you go into Peru, you have business as usual, conditional and not conditional considered international investments. When you go into Argentina, it's the same, okay? So Mexico, for example, is willing that you can have reduction considered greenhouse effects, greenhouse gas of 22%, and also in black carbon 51%, but additionally as a conditional contribution of reduction up to 30% of greenhouse considered black carbon. You have conditionalities. So how you repack this? What is the baseline that you can bring these countries together in such a way that you can have an arrangement to convince to play together based on national interests and national realities, but how you can have regional core benefits consider climate agenda. This is really important to be, in my opinion, to have a new leadership, a regional leadership that can bring countries together, understand the national demands, understand the local needs, but more than this, what is the ambition that Latin America wants to put in practice, wants to play, consider not only natural resource assets that we have, but how can you use this based on the new economies that are coming, the green ones, the blue ones, the purple ones, etc., etc. It's an agenda that's an opportunity for the region. Climate change is a development, a geopolitical issue. It's a powerful agenda for these countries, developing countries. We have alternatives to promote development based on low carbon economy. Brazil is a clear example for this, okay? But we need to motivate based in an innovative way to have political ambition. So Green Deals in the United States, you have an expression that don't show to us, and you have also European Union, you have China. We cannot forget the role of China in Latin America as a crucial partner of investments, economic and technological investments. And so we need to repack this, in my opinion, to understand what are the assets that bring us together and make clear that it would be probably easier for us to achieve solutions even before net zero by 2050, if you have this ambition well defined and you have really strategic and geopolitical arrangements for this region. If not, you have this absolutely fragmented as a puzzle, okay, without the political and economic connections that you need. And more than this, probably will use transition to postpone solutions and not to go into the trade-offs and to make sure that you can move this beyond we have today. My last comment, deforestation is something that should be out of the agenda, not only because of climate stability, but because this is a setback considered the national and regional development. Okay, this is most based on environmental crime, okay, with no add value for social development or even for regional and local economy development. So we need to put this aside, but this is a law enforcement. A country like Brazil knows how to do this, and we need to move in the future. And for this, it'd be very interesting that you can discuss together with the CLAC and other international institutions what are the critical arrangements that we need to put in practice to convince not only to be together to tackle climate change, but to have some shortcuts to improve our performance in some critical economic issues. And don't forget the role of international trade, for example, as I mentioned, in plate basing, when we have Mercosur and European Union trade agreement debate today. So we need to connect things, we need to understand the trade-offs, we need to understand what are the clear challenge short-term perspectives, and what you want when you bring, for example, nature-based solutions and net zero strategy to run to 2050, but we need to be transparent, we need to understand what the trade-offs, what are the difficulties, and how indeed, what are the critical pillars that should come to show with transparency and accountability that we are changing. My personal opinion, land use, mainly agriculture sector, is a critical sector to readdress Latin American ambitions, consider climate global challenges. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Isabella. Really, we need Brazil back again. Another as US. So to finish with the first presentation, Landry Signet, Professor Landry Signet, the African continent also faces great challenges and threats as a consequence of the climate change. Such increased desertification, food crisis. What is expected of 26 for Africa. What proposal have our initiatives have been done? You should unmute. We can't hear. You have a microphone below?
Perfect. Hello, everyone, and thank you very much for offering this unique opportunity to engage on an incredibly important topic. So I would like to commend the organizers of the event, and I'm also honored to be part of such a distinguished group of panelists. Perhaps let me put a few things in context to start with some trends related to Africa. So it is clear that the trend that we see are pointing to urgent need for climate change adaptation and mitigation for the sustainability of African economies and diverse system and inhabitants among others. So the continent may lose up to 12% of GDP for an increase of 4% of 4 degrees Celsius per the African Climate Policy Center. So we have had also the jobs which are threatened on the continent. Agriculture, for example, during the pandemic, we have seen an increase in agricultural activity in numerous countries, but simultaneously an increase also of the percentage of people malnourished, undernourished, or food insecurity in general connected to poor climate conditions. So those are some of the characteristics, let alone also the connection that we have on the continent between climate change and fragility, climate change contributing in the context of scarce resources to increase tensions, and when this is also merged with limited governance, so that generate more conflict, as you are seeing in the Sahel, in the LAC Chad region, in various countries, Mali, Chad, among others. So the link between climate change and conflict is clear. The link between climate change and growth, economic growth or economic performance on the continent is there. So many of the farmers of rice, for example, of wheat were expected to decrease by about 12 and 21% respectively. You also have the direct impact on health, where about 34% of global disability adjusted life years in sub-Saharan Africa, those numbers are of great concern. So those are some of the numbers or facts that I wanted to share, let alone the LAC Chad, where you have the largest African largest bodies of fresh water, which are shrink tremendously, putting at risk over 30 million people who are living in the LAC Chad regions. So those statistics are really showing the critical importance of global but also local actions to address those challenges. Now, African countries are taking action. So, of course, to create also their NDCs in alignment with the Paris Agreement on adaptation, mitigation. So you also have recently numerous African countries such as Ethiopia, Kenya, Nigeria, South Africa, Angola, Zambia, Senegal, or Sudan have also either submitted stronger NDCs targets or the new and improved NDC targets ahead of COP26. For example, Angola has discussed a mitigation strategy to reduce GHG emissions by 15% by 2025 without external support, and by 24% reduction in addition with external support. So definitively numerous of those factors are critical. So how will Africa position itself. It is clear that the Committee of Africans Head of States and Governments on Climate Change, established by the African Union Assembly of Head of State and Government, are really trying to contribute to accelerate an African common position on climate change, of course, through various negotiations which have that the continent and many leaders, in which many leaders have been involved. It is clear that given the heterogeneity of African countries in terms of size of the economy, in terms of climate, in terms of political orientation, among others, the type of consensus on the continent is quite different to the one that we have in the European Union, for example, but it remains very important. And one of the core challenges is also how to implement successfully those NDC, especially the one which require additional funding, because as pointed out, some of the dimension are aligned with what the countries can self-sustain, but most of the targets could only be achieved in a context of collaboration, of support among others. So those are some of the critical factors which need to be taken into consideration. And in the broader strategy, numerous factors are integrated, and I think some have spoken about the critical importance of infrastructure, of building capacity to manage risk, to seize the opportunity for combating climate change, among other factors, especially in the context of COVID-19 and the new SDRs which have been committed, how to build a greener African economy post-COVID-19 with the approximately $650 billion of SDR, which can help provide more liquidity and be spent in the way which will be aligned to create sustainability. How to align those strategies, for example, also with the African Continental Free Trade Area, which was recently created, the largest free trade area since the creation of the World Trade Organization, at least in terms of numbers of countries. And so how to ensure transparency in the implementation of those various initiatives. So some of the key priority for Africa definitively will include the energy question. So how to ensure a successful energy transition, moving to sustainable clean energy, how to secure foreign direct investment to unlock such a potential, to unlock the potential of domestic economies, but also to facilitate that energy transition, to facilitate sustainability, to facilitate also the development of early detection mechanism of smart agriculture, among others. So financing will be a critical part of the project. Energy transition, also critical part of the broader objective. Capacity building will also be a core element, especially through various partnerships which will be adopted. And if I speak about some specific goals, because we have the African position, African countries, as you know, have different priorities, but being more specific about some of the African nationally determined contributions, South Africa, for example, has shown a tremendous leadership, has revised the NDC to 2030 to really lower the emission and develop also the low emission development strategy by 2050. So those are some of the core elements that South Africa would say a leader on the continent for some of those broader questions is adopting. Similarly, Rwanda has been also ambitious, discussed about a 38% reductions of emission compared to business as usual. So we have effort from African countries, whether African giants or some of the largest African economies, such as South Africa, but also smaller but important player such as Rwanda, which are really activating and committing to do more, of course, subject in some cases to funding. So in the broader African strategy also, or the broader activities, because the African continent has a climate change strategies, and with the chief negotiator trying to harmonize various positions, I think they have about 4 or 5 key results which are expected in the broader strategy. So one of the goals is to really build effective institutional capacities to implement climate change strategies, of course, going through research and innovation, entrepreneurship, education, among other. A second result anticipated is also a regional and national climate change strategies, which will be harmonized. So the harmonization will also help having a national or a continental position when engaging with the rest of the world. So connecting this to the third goal, the third goal is really to try to make Africa speak with one voice versus multiple voice. That will therefore help building negotiation capacity, with the fourth also result being the resilience and the building of the resilience and the reduction of the vulnerabilities by prioritizing numerous measures, including adaptation, early warning systems, the reduced loss of and damages, among other, and finally the increased access to finance. So I definitely think that at COP26, one element where all the African countries are likely, or most, if not all the African countries are likely to agree, is on the increased access to finance, including private capital, but also foreign aid, among other, and various engagement. So I think those are some of the preliminary points that I wanted to highlight, but I'll be happy to further expand, including on some of the resources or projects or plan with the aiming at achieving those goals, because some countries here again are ahead of other. Angola, for example, which has updated the NDC as of May of this year, has developed a series of tools to help achieve the goal, including a national environmental fund, a national electricity fund, super fund of agricultural development in Angola, and they're also building on Angola sovereign fund. So they are really building from their domestic resources while they're trying to also attract international climate finance funds, including the one for least developed countries, and engaging through the carbon market. And many other countries, such as Rwanda, for example, have also adopted strategies. And in the broader negotiation, African countries also have the African adaptation initiatives, which aim to enhance action on adaptation while addressing the financial gap and implementing measures which will reduce disaster, among others. So they have various flagship programs going from the climate information services, advancing risk transfer in Africa, the LAC child driver basin early warning system, and the knowledge management program for adaptation. But you also have another program, which is the African Renewable Energy Initiative, which also aims to accelerate and scale up the harnessing of the continent tremendous potential. So again, I'm used to speak for a very long time, to teach 3 hours courses, sometimes intensive 1 week sessions. So I will pause here to give the opportunity to also have a broader conversation. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much. Very interesting proposals. Thank you. And now we have 20 minutes only 20 minutes to exchange little questions. I have a question from the chat in YouTube from Mark Aspinwall from FIDE. He said, interesting to learn these commitments in the Atlantic space, but how much policy learning or diffusion is occurring across the region? For example, is the EU learning from elsewhere, and the same for US and Africa and Latin America? So this diffusion of the initiatives. And I think there are two questions that have been mentioned for all of you, and it could be interesting to talk more about that. One is the importance of the technological innovation, and the danger that this creates more asymmetries between not only countries, but between people who can access to these new technologies. So how do you want, which kind of initiatives will be necessary to address this danger? And also, do you think that with this transition to the green economy, could be arise also geopolitical tensions between different kinds of technologies, like happened with the digital transition, or, for example, even with the vaccine, the access to the vaccine? Do you think that this geopolitical competition could be arise also, and how to avoid that? Especially, I think it's interesting to know the vision from the south, but also from the north, for both of them. And the other question that I think it's important to address for this dialogue is the question of the social consequences of this the transition, and the inequalities, and how to avoid to create more social tensions. For example, I am thinking in the protests that happened in France with the yellow gilets, and also in other countries of Latin America when the price of the oil was rising, and how that creates instability. How to create the commitment of the public support to the changes to this transition. It's necessary more transparency, more education. How to work with these tensions, social tensions that this transition can create. So we will follow the same order of the interventions. So Dan, if you have another questions you want to address to exchange with other of your presentations, you can do also.
Thank you, Anna, and I appreciate the comments from my other colleagues, all very interesting. Anna, on some of your points, I think the Biden administration is making a fundamental point that climate, the environment, is too important to be treated as an environmental issue only. And it has to be embedded in an approach to societal transformation that is also linked to recovery, as the other colleagues have said. Moving our economies and our societies from sickness to health is frankly our overall priority still. But we can do that in ways that facilitate our climate goals. And in order to build a consensus for that, you have to show people that moving to a different model of society is not going to make them worse off. You have to put policies in place that will help that happen. And that's very daunting, especially in the United States, when a good part of the political class still are fighting the very premise. So it's a challenging task. But you can see everything the Biden administration is trying to do is to embed the climate issue into a bigger picture issue of economic recovery and societal resilience. And that's how they're going to approach it. So I think that would be one point. I only make one other point, which is you asked about learning and so on. During the Obama administration, there are probably two learning moments that happened during the earlier process, COP process, if you will. One was the U.S. finally got behind the closed doors with China without the Europeans in the room and tried to, arrange a deal. And the Europeans were very upset about that, or at least they realized they weren't necessarily making the final deal. So back to competition. But that first one didn't work. That first effort to get a deal didn't work when it was just the U.S. and China and, not having everybody together. The ultimate deal, the Paris deal, in my view, was, one of the first examples I've seen of a pan-Atlantic coalition working on a major geopolitical issue. If you think about what finally sealed the deal in Paris, it was the United States, Europe, Latin America, and Africa coming together around a set of goals and saying this is the deal we are aligning on, and then approaching countries like China and others to basically come together along those lines. To me, that was a revolutionary way of thinking about the pan-Atlantic, that for South America, Central America, Africa, there is an Atlantic vision for these countries that they have yet to walk through with us because of legacy, history, and legacies. And we still are, unfortunately, tied into this North Atlantic, South Atlantic perspective when we should think about the pan-Atlantic. And the pan-Atlantic, in my view, is going to become more important in a competitive geopolitical climate than in the past. It offers Africa another window to engage in the world, as well as South and Latin America, as well as the US and Europe. But we have to go through that window together and talk about what's distinctive about the Atlantic Basin that's different than the Pacific or the Indo-Pacific, if you will. I think there are a number of things. Anna and I have worked together over many years on that topic. But climate change and the Paris Agreement, for me, was an example of what we could do together if we think in a pan-Atlantic way.
Chaco? Yes?
Thanks, Anna. Well, let me start by agreeing with Dan. That was a very important moment in the geopolitics of climate change when this high ambition coalition came together, including Brazil, I might add, as one of its supporters. That was a very significant breakthrough in bringing the pressure on China and India to follow. Whether we can replicate that again in Glasgow, I think is difficult to say. Paris was very much about agreeing goals, which are, I guess, in the political landscape of things, relatively easy as compared to demonstrating that you're actually completing or implementing those goals. And Glasgow is very much about the latter. And I think that some of the progressive countries that came together to support Paris in Paris are now a bit disappointed in the extent to which we've all been following through on the deal that we agreed in Paris. And that has to do with climate finance and the shortfall that we're facing on the climate finance target that we set in Copenhagen. But it's also about the NDCs. Many governments have acted, but not enough, at least at this stage, to bring 1.5 into reach. And I think the real test for that kind of coalition now is how much the kind of complex political economy that both the professor and the minister described in their regions will allow developing countries to bring pressure on the major economies like China and India that have so long been their allies in delivering the emissions reductions, but also the greening of things like the Belt and Road initiative and other aspects of finance that are no longer just about what the North decides to invest in, but increasingly what the major players in the South are investing in as well, both domestically and internationally. So we'll see whether we can bring those politics together as the different stages of the climate regime evolve. Maybe just very quickly, do we in the EU learn from others in the development of our policy? Absolutely. The emissions trading system that I described was an idea very much hatched in the United States to get sulfur dioxide under control. And we developed it in the EU for carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases. There have been public transit innovations in the EU that drew directly on the Brazilian experience in rolling out effective and attractive public transportation in some major Brazilian cities. So we do try to learn even as we're leading from others. And maybe a last question about how do you get the public to support what you are doing? I think it is about making sure that the science is clear and transparent and understandable. It's about helping the public understand the co-benefits of reducing emissions, including improvements in public health and quality of life, but also that investments in climate change can help create more innovation and more jobs, and that the transition that we're committing to will be just, as I think that all the panelists have referred to as being really important. And I'll stop there.
Thank you, Jacob. Yes, but I have another question for you from the chat. This is directly for you, for Brazil. It is, what are the expectations from Brazil at the COP26, especially after the Minister Salles left his position? And since Brazil seeks finance from US, is there hope for environment action, or should we be skeptical?
Oh God. Okay. I think that we need a new webinar to answer this question, but I do my best to try to probably highlight 2 or 3 points and try to answer this question. Okay. After Salles, we have a new minister. It's not clear today in Brazil what would be the position of this new minister, but don't forget it, that who takes decision on climate in Brazil today is President Bolsonaro. Okay, it's absolutely clear. I'm a pragmatic woman. I used to be optimist, but absolutely pragmatic. And I'm not here. I'm not hoping that we change. Probably what's happened is that to have another players, another adults into the room managing the agenda. Okay, because Salles used to have the coordination of the climate governance and closer to the president. And now, probably you have Minister of Foreign Affairs, because also have a new Minister of Foreign Affairs, and you can see his performance during the Mr. Biden's climate summit, that to have a new political and diplomat position from Brazil. Okay, it was different. Even if you pay attention to Bolsonaro's speech, you have the use of some words and expressions that is like Itabaraty is back. Okay, and it's very interesting because it was a political strategy to say that we're looking forward to address better climate diplomacy in Brazil. In the past, you used to play together Minister of Environment and Minister of Foreign Affairs, for example, Paris Agreement. Itabaraty was my partner, okay? But today, during Salles' administration, Salles was the head of the agenda. But as I mentioned before, the new minister, nobody knows yet what will be his position, but probably you have Minister of Economy, Minister of Agriculture, and Minister of Foreign Affairs, and also Central Bank that will jump into this agenda because this is absolutely important. What is happening today, in spite of the guidelines of the federal government, because it's critical issue for agriculture as land use, it's absolutely important for financial system security in Brazil. The central bank is working hard with risk climate risks, new rules and procedures. Okay, you have national development banks in Brazil also fully engaged on the climate change and discuss low carbon infrastructure investment, for example. And we need to understand also the role of agriculture, Minister of Agriculture, that has a new plan for low carbon agriculture ambition until 2030. Okay, so we need to understand the interest that this agenda will bring together and how they will influence the Brazilian position considered COP26. What is very important to observe, consider climate, carbon market, Brazilian society wants this, economic sector wants this, and the difficulty that we have today, it's exactly in Itamaraty. Okay, so it's important to understand these trade-offs today in Brazil. My last comment, because I don't have much time, only to highlight something very important to be observed. When you go into international cooperation and you put in practice climate change ambition, okay, we need to understand the local needs, as everyone here mentioned this, and also the global co-benefits. To have Harry, Mary, Joachim, and other ones on board, they need to understand their role, not only based on threats, but also based on the solutions. I have a job, I don't have a job. I have an infrastructure, can access, I can have a new house, I can have housing because we have housing gap. What indeed, how we can manage this agenda with a clear and transparent language that come on, we are doing this to make sense, not only globally, but also in short-term perspective, how can we influence this? But when you go into Amazon region, that everyone's around the world, including us, Brazilian, wants to discuss, I'm very comfortable because the lowest rate of deforestation in Amazon, it was exactly during my administration. So I'm very comfortable to discuss this, okay? So when you go there, it's very interesting. We have the Amazon Basin, the pan-Amazon Basin. All the countries there, consider international cooperation criteria, they are middle-income countries. But when you go into the region, Amazon region of these countries, they are low-income countries. So we need new lens, okay, to put climate change ambition in practice. This is really a good example that illustrates very well, because you go into the traditional ways of international cooperation, you have barriers to access funds. It's the same when they're discussing green financing, and you have different promises around the world that do this, but put this in practice is not easy, considering the criteria and the contradictions of international cooperation models system that we have today. So to put in practice climate change, to put in practice post-2020 framework that will come from Biodiversity Convention, to understand better how we can go into planetary boundaries, how you understand the challenges, even the emerging economies, as mentioned, for Jeffrey, consider China, India, and one, and also as Don proposal that we can have a pan-Atlantic alliance that I fully agree, it's very important to discuss this because we have the tradition of South cooperation, okay? We need to understand what are the trade-offs and with a pragmatic approach and with a short-term perspective to engagement, but a mid-term perspective to have partnership, how indeed we step by step will replace the old ways, the old lens, and bring the lens into the country, into the game. My feelings, Brazil used to play an important cooperation with African countries, for example, less than 10 years ago. We are able to have extreme poverty eradication, you have hunger eradication, you have everything. What's happened today that Brazil in 2.5 years have the setbacks that we are living. We are sharing with the world. We are sharing no solidarity with the world. This is completely different of our culture. And it was high influence what's happened in the United States, consider the former President Trump. So don't forget it. We need to bring people closer. We need to change our lens if you have the ambitions of the future. If not, still you will be fight with the past. And this doesn't make sense considering the digital and climate age that coming together in the 21st century. So thank you very much for the opportunity to join you today. And I think that my friend from Africa would like to close the session, sing for us, and say that we together in Pan-Atlantic Alliance, together with the international cooperation, we can make a difference for a better world. I do believe in this, but we need to work hard. And don't forget the new lens that we need, considering social demands, inequalities, human development, and also democracy. It's critical to discuss democracy if you want this new climate world. Be sure of this, okay? Based on my experience, I had to learn a lot, but let's do. Brazil will be back. I hope so. Let's do it together. Thank you.
Thank you. We hope. So yes, we have the 5 last minutes for you, Landry Signé. The floor is yours. You are in mute.
So thank you very much. Sorry for the mute. So thank you very much again. It is very difficult to speak after all those eloquent intervention with my fellow panelists. But let me perhaps cover a few elements here. So the question of the importance of technology, and the also question on how to create a broader public support. So it is clear that technologies are playing a key role from different perspectives, whether adaptation, mitigation, including also at the removal level. So technology can not just help reduce emission, for example, through climate smart agriculture, the investment in climate sensitive development initiative, such as helping farmers to sustainably increase agricultural productivity while reducing broader emission. But the same type of solution could also be adopted for water available, and the investment could be made in technology to increase water efficiency in numerous regions, whether around the world. It's relevant for Africa, for Latin America, for Asian countries, among other, and even in the United States. If you go to a region like Alaska, technologies are also really important in helping to support livelihood in a way more aligned with sustainability. So definitively in the context of the 4th industrial revolution, which is characterized by the fusion of technologies, blurring the frontier between, as Carl Schwab said, between the physical, digital, and biological worlds, and also characterized by the scope, the velocity, and the system impact. It is really important to engage and to explore technological solutions to the climate challenge, again, whether for adaptation, but also for carbon removal. We have a new movement of companies innovating to remove carbons around the globe. And this question of technological innovation is also connected to the one of public commitment and public support. And perhaps one of the core tools here which can help making progress is to adopt the core pillars of agile governance and multi-stakeholder collaboration. So you are not anymore in an era where governments can decide. The policy-making process is not anymore a reserved domain for public leaders, but private sector leaders have to be involved, the civil society and broader citizen group. And perhaps 7 steps have to be adopted as well in order to make the process more participative and ensure public support. And as I published in a piece with Steve Harmon, so it's really important to anticipate some of the potential consequences of climate change, but also the innovation which can help solve those challenges and those implications, to really focus also regulation on outcomes versus processes, to create the space for experimentation, to use data to target intervention, leverage the role of business, work across institutional boundary, include citizens in the policy-making process, and finally, collaborate internationally. I will stop here. I can expand again, but I think in the interest of time, I will pause here. Thank you so much again for offering this unique opportunity to engage with so distinguished speakers.
Thank you. Yes, we are on time. I think the panel was very interesting, your presentations and the interventions after the discussion. And at the end of the year, we expect to do another seminar after, we hope that presentially. So then we can analyze which have been the results of the summit, and we can see which are the challenges ahead we should address. So thank you very much for participating. I hope to keep in contact, and will give you the feedback after the seminar.
Thank you very much. Thank you for.
Thank you so
much.
Thank
you, Anna. Bye.